Today we're going to be looking at one of Jesus' teaching that he gave quite often. It's really about motives and why we do what we do. He spent an awful lot of time on motives. But before I get to the actual motives, I'm going to give you a little bit background of the text and give you a little bit context. It's always important before you sort of delve into a passage that you find out what's happening in the passage, who he's speaking to, and what the context is. But first I have to tell you something that happened this morning as I was walking our new puppy. I was out in the open spaces in the fields, and I was just reminded when I had this little pup with me this morning. She's about 28 pounds maybe. So 4 months old, 28 pounds, I'm walking in the open space. And I noticed that way out in the distance in the hills, there's a coyote that is tracking us. And this happens quite a lot in this part of the open space that I walk. These coyotes will basically track. And I was reminded when I was training this pup this morning how important it is that she learn how to listen and that she's obedient. And if she doesn't, I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say that if the puppy doesn't learn how to be obedient, she could die, right? Because we're dealing with sort of life and death when we're out in the open space, when she's so small. And so I was thinking about that. I was thinking about obedience and listening and the importance of it. And it reminded me of the reason that God gave the ancient people Israel laws and commandments. It was basically, when you get right down to it, so that you can live well in the land, so that you can stay free, and so that you can have a good life. I mean, that is the whole purpose. In the Old Testament, you go back to the Old Testament, what we call the Ten Commandments, that's the reason that we have any commandments at all, or any instructions at all. It was for our safety, and so that the ancient people, when they went into the promised land, they would know how to live, and they would have a better chance of making it, and making a good life. And what's this strange thing is, the very, very strange thing is that over the centuries, and this happens in every generation, over the centuries, people forget why God would give instruction in the first place. Why would God have any laws in the first place? And they tend to see any kind of instruction or any kind of law or any kind of commandment as a negative thing, which is quite intriguing when you think about it. So if you were to ask, for example, particularly somebody who's unchurched, if you were to, or maybe not, maybe it doesn't matter, but if you were to ask, say, somebody who's about, I don't know, 14, 15, 16, what's the purpose of the commandments? Or what do you think, why do you think God would tell us not to do something? The chances are the answer is going to be, laws are all about telling us we're not allowed to do certain things. God doesn't want us to do certain things. And they're always seen in the light of being restrictive. They're always seen in the light of a negative. You know, if you're a religious person, you're not allowed to do A, B, C, D. Whereas in reality, this is the odd part, that the law for the ancient people was always seen in the light of a positive. I'm giving you this so that all will go well with you and your children and your children's children and also the land, God says. This is an ancient text, goes way, way back to Deuteronomy. I'm giving you some instructions. I'm giving you some commandments so that not only will you have a good life, and not only will you stay free, because remember these people, when they first got the Ten Commandments, they had been enslaved for for hundreds of years, for like 450 years, with ancient Egypt. And they finally get set free from ancient Egypt. They're traveling to the promised land. They get to the promised land. When they get to the promised land, they get these commandments, these instructions of how to live. And God says, I'm giving you these instructions for you, for your children. I'm also giving it to you for the land, which is intriguing. Yeah, we think sustainable agriculture is something new. Actually not. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. If you treat the land carefully and well, it will produce, it will be abundant. If you treat others well, you will produce, you will be abundant. And if not, then you don't. Anyway, that's just a little bit history there. But so this morning in our text, it's Mark chapter 7. Jesus is having a conversation with some religious leaders. One thing you'll notice, patterns are so important to notice in Scripture. Most of the arguments Jesus has in the New Testament is with religious leaders. Why? Because they're the ones that seem to misunderstand him and take the worst possible construction on any of his teachings. So today we have a look at Mark 7, and the religious leaders are criticizing him. They're criticizing his students, and they're saying that you're not really living properly. How come your students, your disciples, are eating with defiled hands? Now, in order to understand this text, you do need to go back and understand a little bit about the culture and what was expected at that time. The tradition was 2,000 years ago that, and many of the ancient Jewish people had this, they had a ritual hand washing that they did before they ate. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with cleanliness in the sense of germs, because this is long, long before germs were discovered. This is like a ritual hand washing. The ancient Jewish people would do this before they would eat. It was really a tradition. We've got lots of traditions too, like for example, sometimes people will kneel when they come into church, or they'll cross themselves when they pray, or they'll put baptismal water on their head, or, they're traditions. The ancient people had traditions too. I think probably they were a lot more important to them than many of us. But they had these traditions, they had these rituals, and it wasn't so much that Jesus was bothered with traditions per se. What bothered him was when the tradition, the hand washing, for example, in this case, became the most important thing, and the essence or the God part was missing. That's what always seems to provoke Jesus to anger or irritation, that people would continually miss the point. They would get tied up with the tradition, the religious behavior, whatever that would be. Could be a ritual hand washing, could be not working on the Sabbath in the ancient times. Whatever the tradition was, or whatever the ritual was, what bothered Jesus is that people forgot why the tradition was done in the first place. In other words, it was completely divorced from God. And so in this passage, these religious leaders are asking him, how come your students don't do the traditions of the elders? How come they don't do the ritual hand washing? And Jesus, knowing where they're coming from, understanding that they're completely off track in their understanding of people and their understanding of God, says to them, the ancient prophet Isaiah was right when he spoke about people like you. You say all the right things and you act religious, but your hearts are so far from God. So it's like Jesus is saying, it's so easy for people to pretend to be religious people. In our case, it would be church people. It's so easy for people to say they believe in God, but really, when you get right down to it, their attitudes, their lives, their hearts, there's nothing attractive about them at all. There's nothing about God in them at all. They're just critical, angry people. They've forgotten what's truly, truly important. And Jesus often addresses this. He often addresses the fact that it is so easy, particularly for religious people or spiritual people, to get tied up with the wrong things and to concentrate on the wrong things. And it's really a passage that warns about how easy it is to miss the point in life. It's easy to miss the point in our spiritual lives. And if we miss the point in our spiritual lives, we will surely miss the point in all the other parts of our life because they're so connected. Yeah, the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders of the day, they had a high value on, they wanted everyone to believe the way they did and to do things the way they did things. And it bothered them when they saw other people, Jesus particularly, and his students, do things differently. Think outside the box a little bit. Emphasize different things. It bothered them. It bothered them a lot. And of course, if we're applying that passage today, we don't care about ritual hand washing, right? That's not going to bother us. But there might be other things that people do that bother us. There might be other things that people don't do that bother us. There might be other things that come along in our lives that can cause us to have sort of this critical, judgmental attitude toward other people, particularly toward other people who don't think the way we do. And this is always what the Pharisees are getting into trouble for. They're too busy looking out at others and correcting other people rather than what Jesus would advise is take a moment and stop and check in with yourself, your own motives and your own heart before you start to correct the world. And he goes on to say that you Pharisees, you religious leaders, you're criticizing my students and you're saying that they're defiled. Well, let me tell you, there's nothing outside a person that defiles a person. There's nothing outside that makes a person impure. What makes a person impure is what's going on in the heart. And when Jesus speaks about the heart, he's speaking really about what we would call today our inner drives and motives. Jesus is saying, if you want to understand where evil comes from, you don't have to look out there. Where evil comes from is within. It's from within, Jesus teaches. All sorts of bad things occur within the heart, particularly a heart that's going in the wrong direction. And in this passage he says, where does evil come from? Evil comes from within. Very interesting, because Jesus does not teach, people are basically good. People are basically good at heart and they have the right intentions and they're okay and they'll do the right thing. He actually doesn't teach that at all, which might come as a surprise. He teaches that people left to their own ways without the guidance of God can harm themselves and others and the world. He says, where do you think evil comes from? Where do you think harm comes from? It comes from inside people. That's where it comes from. People can easily get off track. And then he lists all the different ways that people can get off track. He lists that, he says, where do you think adultery comes from? Where do you think avarice, which is greed, comes from? Where do you think fornication comes from? Where do you think pride, wickedness, where do you think all these come from? They come from the motivations of the heart, a heart that is going in the wrong direction. So for Jesus, the heart is really the seat of the person. That's where everything begins inside here and is motivated from this point. He says, no, people are not basically good at heart because they can get off track. And when they get off track, they can go in the wrong direction and do many, many hurtful things, not just to the world and people and animals, but also the planet for that matter, as we've seen, right? So the passage points to this common problem of people getting distracted. And of course, this is actually two religious people, the context. The passage points to the common problem of people getting distracted and critical of how others live and think and believe and not attending to their own inner life. Not attending to their own, as what he would call the heart. We might call it our inner life. Not attending to your own inner life, not attending to our motives, which is a repeated teaching of Jesus. The motive is of utmost importance. It's not what you do, it's why you do what you do. And it takes a bit of self-reflection and self-awareness to even know why we do what we do. Oftentimes we're not really aware because we're just on automatic pilot. So it's actually quite difficult to become aware of our motives. So these religious leaders have come along and they're critical of Jesus, and Jesus basically says, you know what? I don't care if you're a religious leader. You're off track. You're focusing on the wrong things. You're not called to criticize my students. It's not your job to tell me what I do wrong or what my students do wrong. You're supposed to be attending to your own inner life. Each person is supposed to be attending to their own spiritual inner life, their own self-awareness, their own God awareness. And for Jesus, motives direct a life. Motives direct a life. So if you're motivated by envy, let's say, which is a very common one, which is basically thinking something's missing and you're always looking out at what that could be and you're always trying to fill that missing piece. If you're motivated by that, then you'll be driven to put your energy into that. Jesus would say, fine, just so you know that's not following me, that's following envy. Right? So what motivates you drives your life. If you're always looking at what is missing, and you're always going in that direction, and you're always making decisions in that direction, then you're motivated by envy, you're following envy. Now you might not be motivated by envy, you might be motivated by success, for example. You might want to do well at everything. It's the same thing. It's like, okay, then you'll chase success. If that's what your motivation is, that's going to be at your core, and it's going to be why you do what you do. Just so you know, Jesus is saying, that's not following me, that's following success. The motives of the heart, a big pattern throughout Jesus' teaching. He comes to this point time and time again. You might be motivated by a desire to be liked and loved. Now, actually, everybody, I think, is motivated a little bit by success. Everybody is motivated a little bit by the desire to be liked and loved, or envy for that matter. It's about, in order to find your first motivation, You have to step back and think about what takes first place most of the time, right? So yes, we all want to be liked, we all want to be loved, but we're not all going to be motivated to live on a day-to-day basis with that as in the forefront of our mind. You might be motivated by the need to do things right. You have to do things properly. You might be motivated by security. Actually, I'm going down all the Enneagram motivations just now. There's so many things we can be motivated by. I think what's important though for the spiritual life is to narrow it down and find out what you're motivated by. Because that's going to be a big key that will unlock a lot of things for you. None of these motivations are enough, by the way. They don't head a person in the right direction. They're all inadequate, Jesus would say. They're all inadequate. They're not going to get you where you need to go. Will they always be with us? Yes, these motivations will always be with us. However, we don't have to follow them. They won't all, these types of what St. Paul would call worldly things, these kind of motivations are insufficient and incomplete in themselves. They're not worthy to be followed wholeheartedly. Yes, they're a part of our lives. Yes, they're a part of our temperament. Yes, they're a part of our personality. We're not called to follow our personality. We're called to follow Christ. That's a big difference. Jesus teaches a life lived well. Actually, he modeled this. A life lived well is a life motivated and dedicated to pleasing God. It's a dedication to please God, not please ourselves, not follow our temperament, not follow our personalities or be hijacked by our personalities, not pleasing others, pleasing God. And that looks like, pretty much, in my experience, it looks like this. It looks like a constant redirecting in everyday life. In other words, when you're following Christ, there's not a day that will go by that you won't be redirected in some way or another. There's not a day that you won't be given some sort of shift, some sort of guide that will say, no, not that way, this way. No, that success isn't going to give you what you need. No, looking at that person over there and what they have and longing for that, that's not going to fulfill the emptiness you have. No, that fear that you have, that needn't guide you. God is able to take care of you, whatever will happen. You see, what happens is that when we're following Christ is that every day the Spirit of God, this is kind of an amazing thing when you think about it. The Spirit of God, commonly known as the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, comes to us individually. This is a kind of an individual thing, and redirects us and puts us back on track. It's like, not that way, this way. And Jesus is saying, that's really the heart of faith. That's what trusting in God looks like. Religious leaders, it's not about washing your hands and doing the rituals. Or for us today, whatever our traditions would be, whatever. And again, I think traditions are fine. Jesus isn't against traditions. He's against forgetting what's truly, truly important. It's a lot easier, by the way, to do a tradition than it is to have an open, peaceful, gentle, generous heart. If you think about it, right? It's a lot easier to do a religious ritual of sorts, come to church, take communion, put money in the offering plate, whatever it is your ritual is, it's a lot easier to do that than it is to work on these matters of the heart. And it's always, always, always the matters of the heart that Jesus is concerned about. So this Jesus teaching always sort of pulls us back to this time and time again. It's like you've got to get your heart right. You've got to allow God to come, soften your heart, change your heart so that it can be redirected in the right ways. Amen.